I've always known that the ocean was a scary place. For a long time, I thought it was just its depths and size that scared me. But I learned that it's not the ocean that scares me. It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of what might lurk deep below the waves. It was made very apparent to me during what was supposed to be a simple rescue mission. When I was young, I always tried to find ways to help people. Growing up in an orphanage, there were always things to do for the other kids. If someone was being bullied, I was there to help. If a kid didn't get a full meal because one of the nuns were punishing them, I shared my food. While I never did get adopted, much to the nuns' dislike, I always found family with the other kids. Even after I became of age, I still wanted to find ways to help people. After doing some research online, I found the place I wanted to go: the United States Coast Guard. After going through boot camp, I was able to become part of a search and rescue team. For the next several years, I was involved in several rescue operations, ranging from a lost fishing boat to broken down cargo ships. I've also had to fight off some pirates in the Pacific. I was even known as the best swimmer and marksman on my team. My time in the Coast Guard was the best thing I could have ever asked for. That is, until that fateful mission to that damned oil rig. It was a quiet Wednesday morning at 0200 when we were called into a briefing room. The captain was pacing back and forth anxiously. We all filed in and took our seats around the conference table. "Good morning, gents," began the captain. "We have a situation." He pulled up a photo on the projector. The picture was of an oil rig surrounded by the vast expanse of the ocean. As of 2300 yesterday, this oil rig, known as the Aeolaer, has gone dark. All radio contact has been severed. Using satellite imaging, he changed the picture to one of a top-down view of the rig at night. The transport helicopter is still on its path, and the lifeboats are still in their positions. All lights have been turned off, and there are no signs of life. He looks at all of us. The company has requested that we send someone to investigate and find out what happened to the Elias's crew. Nick, our pilot, raised his hand. "If the helipad is occupied, will I just be circling the rig?" "That is correct," the captain replied. "There will be a destroyer several miles away if refueling is necessary. You will fly from the mainland to the destroyer and then hit to the rig." Nick nods in understanding. I raise my hand. "Are we going in armed?" The captain looked toward me. "Yes. We do not know what happened to the rig. One speculation is pirates that haven't stated demands yet, but we do not know for sure." He looks back to Nick and Frank, our flight engineer. "You will also be armed with 204s on the sides, and these 2 gunners will be joining you," he said, motioning to the 2 others at the table. They nodded at us. "Eli and Timothy will fast rope onto the rig and find out what happened to the crew." He motioned toward me and Tim. "Are there any other questions?" None of us spoke up. The captain turned off the projector and looked at all of us. "All right, get moving." "Aye, sir," we responded and headed out of the room. Over the next hour, we put on our gear and grabbed our M4A1 rifles and M9 pistols. We equipped our MH-60 Jayhawk helicopter with 2 M24 Bravo machine guns and several belts of ammunition. The pilots and the flight engineer did their pre-flight check, and we were off. It was a 30-minute flight to the US destroyer where we needed to refuel before commencing our operation. During the flight, we tried to speculate what happened to the rig. "I'm thinking it was the pirates," said Frank. "Nah," said Tim. "If it was the pirates, there would be more damage, and they would have made some ransom demands. Not to mention, the crew didn't even send an SOS. "Well, what do you think it was, Timmy?" Nick asked. "Maybe they dug into some unknown gas bucket that caused them to pass out," Tim speculated. "What about you, Nicky?" he asked. Nick tilted his head for a moment, before shrugging. "Maybe a cruise ship sailed by with a bunch of hot babes on it, and the crew said, 'Screw it,' and left the rig." We all gave a slight chuckle. Tim looked back at me. "What about you, Eli? What do you think happened? I just shook my head, shrugging. I can't say for sure. The circumstances don't make sense. It's as though the rig just stopped working and the crew vanished. Tim nodded in agreement. What about you, Ed? He said to Edward, the co-pilot. Maybe a sea monster, he said. Maybe the Kraken got hungry and thought the rig was a silver platter. We all shivered. Well, I said, let's hope our guns can do something to it, and we can have grilled squid for lunch. We all shared a laugh and continued our trek to the destroyer. We landed on the destroyer and refueled. We all got off to stretch our legs and talk to some of the sailors. I walked up to one whose name tape said Anderson. Hey, I said, waving at him. He nodded in acknowledgement. Any word on the status of the rig? Anderson looked in the direction of the rig, shaking his head. No, it's been dark since we got here. I nodded, thanking him, and headed back to the Jayhawk. I hopped back in and looked at Tim, who was checking his gear. After checking mine, I looked at him and asked, Ready, Timmy? He looked at me and smiled. Locked, cocked, and ready to rock. We fist bump and readied for takeoff. The pilots did their check and lift off. The ship was stationed a few miles away from the rig, and with the light fog that had rolled in, we couldn't get a good view of the rig. Now that we were close, we could see it clearly. All of the visibility and emergency lights were turned off. On the helipad, an H-225 Airbus helicopter was positioned. Its propellers slowly turned in the wind. Nick slowly circled the rig while we scanned the surface. There were no signs of life. A couple of the doors leading inside were open and swaying. Nick flew over the stationary helicopter as me and Tim tossed the fast ropes out the side. I reached down to my radio. Radio check, I say. Loud and clear, Nick responds. Careful down there. We nod and rappel down the ropes. As soon as we hit the pavement, the ropes disengage and land behind us. Me and Tim raise our rifles and start moving toward the staircase. As we headed down, we strained our ears, trying to hear anything that might indicate movement. But the only sounds we could hear was the groaning of the metal moving in the wind. US Coast Guard, is anyone here? Tim yelled. We listened for a minute. No response. While this particular oil rig was not the largest one out there, it was still a good size. We began walking through, passing some open shipping containers on the way. Looking around, we could see loose tools laying about the deck. It was as though the crew just dropped what they were doing and vanished. After clearing the first deck and finding nothing, we decide to head inside. Nick, we're heading inside, I said into the radio. Copy. We'll be out here if you need us. Be careful, he responded. With that, Tim and I followed the signs and found our way to the entrance. The doorway was open and creaking on its hinges. We turned on our flashlights and headed inside. Once inside, we began clearing the halls. US Coast Guard, is anyone here? I yelled. Still no response. At the end of this hall was the dining area. On some of the tables were trays of food that were now molding. There were still no signs of a struggle. It was still as though the crew just up and left. We walked out and found ourselves in another hall. At the end of it, I saw a pair of legs sticking out one of the doorways. US Coast Guard, I said again. No movement. Tim and I looked at each other and slowly made our way towards the legs. I rounded the corner with my rifle raised. I looked past the body and saw that the room was a sleeping quarters. Seeing that no one else was in the room, I began examining the body. I almost jumped back in shock when I looked at it. Its skin was pulled taut and a dark shade gray. The left arm was missing, as though it was ripped off, but there was very little blood on the floor. It was as though all the fluids were sucked out of the body. On its right shoulder, there were large teeth marks that ripped through the uniform and into the flesh. Looking at the marks, it reminded me of the mouth pattern of an anglerfish. I stood up and looked back at Tim. He was looking at me with confusion. "What happened?" he asked, shrugging my shoulders. "Don't know. It's like he was attacked by something." He shivered, and we continued our search. We looked in the other sleeping quarters, but didn't find any other bodies. Seeing nothing else here, we headed up a set of stairs. Once on the next floor, we could see some dark red streaks leading to a closed door. The plaque on the wall said that this room was a recreation room. We looked at each other, and I gripped my M4 tighter. When we got close to the door, we could smell the distinct scent of copper. I grabbed the handle and looked at Tim. He nodded, and I counted down from 3. On 1, I ripped the door open and we went inside. The smell hit us even harder as we surveyed the room. Tim put an arm to his mouth, trying not to vomit. Several bodies were in a pile in the corner of the room next to a smashed TV. The bodies appeared to be in the same condition as the first, all fluids drained, and with those strange bite marks. On a pool table, several limbs were stacked with those same teeth marks all over them. "What the hell?" Tim said. "Who could have done this?" He looked at me. I was at a loss for words. "I don't know, but we need to keep looking." We stepped out and closed the door. "We should look for a control room and get the power back on," I say to Tim. He nods. "Good idea, but if you say we should split up, I swear to God." We both chuckle lightly, trying to forget the mess we saw in the other room. We continued to clear the other rooms in this section of the rig, but we found nothing to indicate what happened. As we were coming to the end of the hallway, I began to hear something. It sounded like singing. It was quiet at first, but it was steadily getting louder. Or closer. The voice was the soft and sweet sound of a woman. I couldn't make out any discernible words, but the sound of it was calming, like the sound of a mother would sing to a crying child to soothe them. I looked back at Tim. "You hear that?" I ask in a whisper. He nods. "You think someone left the radio on or something?" I shake my head. "No, it sounds too clear, and it seems to be coming closer." At this, we both raise our rifles and slowly walk toward the last room in this section. Just before we got to the door, someone walked out. It was a woman. She was absolutely beautiful, with light brown hair, deep blue eyes, and freckles on her face. Her body could only be described as perfect. She was only wearing a 2-piece swimsuit. I noticed that she was talking, and realized that it was her who was singing that comforting song. "Miss, are you alright?" I asked, lowering my rifle. "We're with the US Coast Guard. Are you hurt?" She did not reply. She just continued her song. I looked into her eyes and saw that her gaze was focused behind me. I looked back at Tim. He was standing completely slack. The rifle was loosely dangling at his side. His eyes were glazed over and unfocused. Looking back at the woman, it seemed like she was only focused and singing to Tim. I heard Tim step forward. With a second step, he passed me, walking toward the woman. "Hey, wait," I say to him, but he didn't respond. It seemed as though he was in some sort of trance. I looked back at the woman and was shocked at what I saw. There was a shimmer all around her as Tim got closer. Her teeth seemed to elongate as her jaw started opening far wider than is possible for a human. She started to raise her hand as Tim was only a few feet away, her now long claws and webbed fingers plain to see. But before she could get a grip on Tim, I raised my rifle and put 2 rounds into her chest and 1 in the head. The singing immediately stopped as it slumped to the floor. Now its true form could be seen. The skin of this creature was a dark bluish gray. The eyes were a milky white color. Along the spine and arms were protrusions similar to spiked fins. Both its hands and feet were webbed and tipped with razor-sharp claws. And of course, its mouth had several rows of those razor-sharp anglerfish-like teeth. After a moment of stunned silence, I walked over to Tim and shook him. "You good, Timmy?" I saw that glassy look in his eyes fade as he snapped back to reality. "What happened?" he asked, looking around frantically. I pointed at the creature with my rifle. "Don't know, but I think we found what killed the crew." We both stared at the creature for another moment before making our way to the stairway. Going up the stairs, we saw a sign that said, "Control Room." We entered the room and began reading the controls, looking for a power switch. Finally finding it, I turned the key that was thankfully left and flipped the switch. The sounds of machinery turning on were loud enough to hear through the walls. The lights flickered to life and we turned off our flashlights. "I'm seeing lights turning on down there. Is that you?" Nick asked over the radio. "Yeah," I responded. "Did you find out what happened yet? Did you find the crew?" I looked at him and he shrugs. "We found what was left of them," I say. "We're still trying to find what happened." I turned to Tim. "We should look for a security room. They probably have some surveillance installed around the rig. That might show what happened." Tim nods in agreement. "Good idea. Let's move." We head out the door and continue clearing this deck. Just around the corner, we found a room labeled Security Office. Upon entering, we saw a shriveled corpse cowering in a corner. It was wearing a security guard uniform and had those same bite marks on its shoulder. "Must have seen what happened and tried to hide in here," Tim said. I walked over to a wall of monitors that showed different areas of the rig. I fiddled with the controls and was finally able to rewind the feed before the rig went dark. While there was no audio, the images were clear. The videos showed the workers doing their normal jobs all around the rig. The drillers seemed to be having some mechanical issues, but they were working on fixing it, as what appeared to be the foreman was issuing orders. All of a sudden, his face went blank and his body seemed to relax. A moment after this, the rest of the drill team did the same. They all dropped their tools and stood up. One by one, each monitor started showing the same thing. As soon as every crew member was in this trance, on one camera, the creature climbed over one of the railings around the outside of the deck. At that moment, a chill ran down my back. Because it wasn't just the one creature. After the first one boarded, at least a dozen more followed suit. I looked back at Tim. He was as pale and looked as concerned as I felt. I turned back to the monitors. After the last creature boarded, they all walked toward the same entrance we came in. Once they passed the threshold, all of the crew began to follow. I looked at one monitor that overlooked the control room, speeding up the feed. I saw one of the creatures walk in, and that is where the recording stopped. I reach over and pull out the disc with the recording on it, put it in a hard case, and put it in my pack. I turn back to Tim. "We need to get off this rig and give this to the higher-ups." He nods nervously as we turn to the door. At that moment, the lights cut out. All the machinery powered down, and we were once again plunged into silent darkness. "You good down there? The lights just cut out again," Nick said over the radio. "Nick, there are things on this rig. They are considered hostile. The entire crew was killed by them. We need to get off this rig ASAP." A moment passed. "Copy that. We'll be out here waiting." I looked back to Tim. "Let's move." We began walking toward the stairway we came up. Once we were halfway down the stairs, we began to hear the faintest sounds of singing. I looked back to Tim. "Quick, silence the headsets." We both turned off the noise amplifying microphones on our headsets. I hoped this would be enough to prevent us from going into that trance. We reached the bottom of the stairs and looked around. Down the hallway, towards our exit, one of the creatures was standing there. It seemed to be moving its mouth. Silencing the headsets seemed to work. I grinned at this and raised my rifle. After putting 2 rounds into it, the creature slumped to the ground, unmoving. My grin immediately vanished as, out from around the corner, 4 more of the creatures started running towards us. Both Tim and I started firing into the approaching creatures. Once all 4 were down, I signaled to Tim that we needed to move forward quickly. He nodded in acknowledgement and started walking quickly. We rounded the corner, and coming out of the recreation room, several more creatures ran towards us. They were quickly put down, with one of them getting way too close for comfort. I reloaded and continued forward. We passed the rec room and headed down the last set of stairs. 2 more creatures were waiting at the bottom of the stairs, ready to ambush us. But the stairs were thin, and we just shot them through it. We were just about to pass the galley when one creature leapt out and pinned me to the floor. It snarled at me as it raised a clawed hand and was about to cut into my body. But before it could, Tim came around and put 2 rounds into the creature's head. I threw the corpse off my body and grabbed Tim's outstretched hand. I nodded in thanks, and we continued toward the exit. We burst out the door, and a heavy rain was pouring. We were able to hear the sound of machine guns roaring overhead. The whole rig was lit up with searchlights attached to multiple Black Hawk helicopters. Each one had machine guns firing out the side doors. "Nick, where you at?" I yelled into the radio. "I'm hovering by the helipad. You weren't kidding about those creatures. They're all over the rig." "Who are the other birds?" I asked, referring to the other helicopters. "Don't know," he said. "They just said they were here as support. Just get over here so we can get out of here." "On the way," I responded. Tim reloaded his rifle and nodded. The helipad was on the opposite end of the rig, which meant we would be going between the shipping containers again. We ran forward and into the carnage. The deck was littered with the bullet-riddled bodies of the creatures. Passing between the containers, several creatures tried to pounce down onto us, but what the helicopters didn't hit, we did. One creature managed to claw at my leg, but all it did was slice off a knee pad before I unloaded into its torso. We finally reached the helipad, and our Jayhawk was there hovering several yards away from the rig. The door gunners were putting in work with their 240s, trying to keep the creatures off us. "Nick, we're here!" I yelled into the radio. "Copy. You're going to have to jump in," he replied. While he flew closer, I turned and continued sending rounds into the approaching creatures. I saw dozens of these creatures climbing over the guardrails. As soon as one fell to our bullets, another would just take its place. "All right, ladies," Nick said on the radio. "Let's get moving." Me and Tim turned and ran toward the Jayhawk. It was hovering a few feet away from the helipad since the civilian helicopter was still parked. I sprinted and leapt into the side of the Jayhawk. One of the gunners caught me and pulled me to my feet. I raised my rifle and continued firing into the creatures. Tim started to sprint, but one of the creatures came up from the side and tackled him to the ground. I fired into it and it slumped onto Tim. Before he could push the body off, the swarm had made it up the stairs. Nick started pulling away as the swarm engulfed Tim. "No!" I yelled, still firing into the mass of the creatures. But I knew it was already too late. A few of the creatures tried jumping at the Jayhawk, but we were too far. I slammed my fists into the side of the Jayhawk, swearing and crying. Frank came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Are you injured?" he asked. I just fell into one of the empty seats and shook my head. He patted my knee and went back to his seat. I looked out the open door and took one last look at the rig. With the lights from the other helicopters, I could see dozens upon dozens of those creatures climbing the legs of it. The last thing I saw was the explosion as a missile hit it, collapsing the whole thing into the ocean. I continued to silently cry as we made our way back to the destroyer. Over the next few days, I was questioned many times by several different people regarding what happened. The first few were high-ranking military officers, but several were men in suits that I guessed were from 3-letter agencies. The surveillance recording was taken the moment I got back to base. I also had to sign several NDAs. On the 4th day, I was called into the conference room where we did our debriefs. Standing at the end of the table was the captain, who was talking with a bald man in a suit. Once I entered, the captain shook the man's hand and exited. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Peterson," the man said. I sat at the table, and he walked over and took a seat beside me. "My name's Tom," he said with a southern drawl. "I understand you had quite a difficult mission." I nod slowly. What were those things?" I asked. He closed his hands together and looked solemnly at me. "Those were what are known as sirens." I looked at him dumbfounded. I remember reading about sirens in old mythology books, but I thought them to be just that, myths. He nodded, seeming to know what I was thinking. "They are a nasty breed. Normally, they are only found in groups of up to 8 to 10. But the area where the oil rig was drilling must have uncovered an area where they didn't want us to be." I tried to process this information. There had to be a couple hundred of those things there. "We think that the drill might have hit a large nest, city, or whatever those creatures call a home. We're still trying to survey the area." I just looked at the floor. If I heard something like this just 5 days ago, I would have thought this man was either superstitious or crazy. "From what I understand, you handled yourself very well. How would you like to join my organization that specializes in destroying these types of creatures?" I looked up at him with his hand outstretched. I thought back to what happened to those crew members. I remembered the terrified look on Tim's face, right before he was swarmed by the sirens. I gripped Tom's hand firmly. "I'm in." He smiles. "Welcome to the Paranormal Control Unit, or PCU for short."